the brass knuckles connected with her jaw with a sickening crack that echoed through the empty parking garage. Blood splattered across the concrete as Amara Volkov crumpled to her knees, her worn denim jacket torn at the shoulder. 3 men stood over her like vultures, their shadows stretching long under the flickering fluorescent lights of the Riverside Mall parking structure in Cedar Falls, Montana. What they didn't know, what nobody in this forgotten mountain town knew, was that they had just made the most catastrophic mistake of their lives. The quiet girl they were beating wasn't just another victim. She was Petty Officer First Class Amara "Ghost" Volkov, the most decorated female Navy SEAL in modern military history, and their first punch had just awakened something that had been sleeping for far too long. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The largest of her attackers, a man with arms like tree trunks and a spiderweb tattoo crawling up his neck, grabbed a fistful of her dark auburn hair and yanked her head back. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, freak," he snarled, his breath reeking of cheap beer and cigarettes. His name was Jake Morrison, though everyone in Cedar Falls just called him Tank. At 6'5" and 280 pounds of solid muscle, he'd been the town's unofficial enforcer for the better part of a decade. Behind him stood his 2 loyal followers, Danny "Wrench" Peterson, a wiry mechanic with oil permanently stained under his fingernails, and Tommy Briggs, a local dealer whose idea of intimidation was flashing the butterfly knife he carried in his back pocket. Amara said nothing. She never said much of anything these days. To the 3,200 residents of Cedar Falls, she was just another damaged soul who drifted into their mountain community 6 months ago, renting the studio apartment above Maple's Diner on Main Street, working double shifts, washing dishes, and bussing tables for $8.50 an hour. She kept her head down, spoke only when spoken to, and minded her own business. The perfect victim, in other words. "I asked you a question, bitch," Tank continued, tightening his grip on her hair. "My cousin Ricky says you've been asking questions about his business down at the warehouse. Says you've been real curious about what comes and goes in those shipping containers." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "See, Ricky doesn't like curious people, and neither do I." Amara's gray eyes, the color of storm clouds gathering over the Rocky Mountains, remained fixed on the oil-stained concrete beneath her knees. Those eyes had once tracked enemy combatants through the mountains of Afghanistan. They had identified improvised explosive devices buried along convoy routes in Iraq. They had memorized the faces of high-value targets across 3 continents, but tonight they were studying the positioning of 3 small-town thugs who had no idea what they had stumbled into. Wrench stepped forward, cracking his knuckles with theatrical precision. "Maybe she's deaf, Tank. Maybe we need to speak louder." He drew back his fist, aiming for her ribs. The blow never landed. What happened next took exactly 2.7 seconds. Amara had counted similar sequences thousands of times during her 8 years of active duty. Wrench's punch was telegraphed, slow, predictable. She twisted left, letting his momentum carry him forward while her right hand shot up to grab his wrist. One sharp rotation, and the distinctive pop of dislocated joints filled the garage. Wrench screamed. Tommy fumbled for his butterfly knife, but Amara was already moving. She swept Tank's legs. All 280 pounds of him crashed to the concrete like a felled redwood. Before he could recover, her boot connected with the pressure point just below his ear. He didn't get back up. Tommy finally managed to open his knife, the blade gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "I'll cut you. I swear I'll—" Amara stepped into his guard. Her left hand deflected the knife, while her right delivered a precise strike to his solar plexus. The blade clattered harmlessly across the garage floor as Tommy folded like origami, gasping for breath that wouldn't come. 3 men. Less than 3 seconds. Not a single wasted movement. For a moment the garage was silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic from Highway 12. Amara stood perfectly still, her breathing controlled, her heart rate barely elevated. Old instincts were surfacing, instincts she had tried very hard to bury when she'd hung up her uniform and disappeared into the mountains of Montana 6 months ago. Tank groaned, trying to push himself up on his elbows. Blood trickled from his nose where his face had met the concrete. He looked up at Amara with a mixture of shock and rage, unable to process what had just happened. "What the hell? Who are you?" Amara picked up her fallen backpack, the same threadbare canvas bag she carried to work every day, filled with nothing more threatening than her tips from the diner and a paperback novel. To anyone watching, she looked exactly like what she was supposed to be, a quiet, unremarkable woman in her late 20s, trying to rebuild her life in a place where nobody asked questions about your past. "Nobody important," she said quietly, her voice steady and unremarkable. It was the same voice that had coordinated extraction operations behind enemy lines, the same voice that had called in airstrikes against terrorist strongholds, the same voice that had once briefed admirals and generals in the Pentagon. But tonight it belonged to a dishwasher from Cedar Falls who just wanted to go home. She walked toward the garage exit, stepping carefully around Tommy, who was still curled on the ground, trying to remember how breathing worked. At the entrance, she paused and looked back at Tank, who was now sitting up against a concrete pillar, holding his bleeding nose. "Next time," she said, her tone conversational, almost friendly, "you might want to ask more questions before you throw the first punch." As Amara disappeared into the Montana night, none of the 3 men lying in that parking garage understood what had just happened to them. They had no idea that the quiet dishwasher they'd tried to intimidate had once led a team of Navy SEALs through the mountains of Hindu Kush. They didn't know she had been personally decorated by the Secretary of Defense for actions so classified that they would never appear in any official record. They couldn't have imagined that the woman they'd cornered like prey had once been known throughout the Special Operations community as Ghost, a legend who could move through enemy territory like smoke and disappear without a trace. All they knew was that their simple intimidation job had gone very, very wrong. And this was only the beginning. By morning, the entire town of Cedar Falls knew something had happened in the Riverside Mall parking garage. Tank Morrison sat in the emergency room of Clearwater Regional Hospital, his nose reset and packed with gauze, telling anyone who would listen that he'd been jumped by a gang of thugs from the next county over. His pride wouldn't allow him to admit the truth that a 5'6" dishwasher had put him and his crew on the ground in less than 3 seconds. But Tank Morrison wasn't the type to let things go. 2 days later, Amara was wiping down tables at Maple's Diner when the bell above the front door chimed. She didn't need to look up to know who had walked in. The sudden silence that fell over the lunch crowd told her everything. Tank entered first, a purple bruise spreading across the bridge of his nose like spilled ink. Behind him came his reinforcements. 6 men this time, including his older brother Dale Morrison, who ran the local auto shop and served as Cedar Falls' unofficial mayor of intimidation. "Well, well," Dale announced loudly, his voice carrying across the small diner like a foghorn. "Look what we got here, the famous kung fu dishwasher." He was a bigger man than Tank, if that was possible, with arms like steel beams and hands that looked like they could crush walnuts. The Harley-Davidson vest he wore was decorated with patches from motorcycle clubs across 3 states. Every conversation in the diner stopped. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Coffee cups remained suspended in midair. The other customers, mostly local ranchers, truckers passing through on Highway 12, and the occasional tourist who'd gotten lost on their way to Glacier National Park, all turned to stare. This was better than anything they'd see on television. Maple Henderson, the diner's 67-year-old owner, emerged from behind the counter. She was a tough woman who'd raised 4 sons on her own after her husband died in a mining accident, but even she looked nervous. "Dale, I don't want any trouble in my place." "No trouble, Maple," Dale replied with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Just came in for some coffee and conversation with my new friend here." He gestured toward Amara, who continued wiping the same table she'd been cleaning for the past minute. "See, Tank here tells me he had a little misunderstanding with Miss—" He paused theatrically. "You know, I don't think any of us actually know your name, sweetheart." Amara finally looked up. Her gray eyes moved slowly around the room, cataloging exits, identifying potential weapons, assessing the position of every person in the diner. It was a reflex as natural as breathing, the kind of tactical awareness that had kept her alive in places where American soldiers weren't supposed to be. "It's Amara," she said quietly. "Amara." Dale clapped his hands together like he'd just solved a puzzle. "Beautiful name. Foreign, isn't it? You're not from around here, are you, Amara?" "No, sir." "Where are you from, then?" "Lots of places." She returned to wiping the table, each motion slow and methodical. Tank stepped forward, emboldened by his brother's presence. "She's lying, Dale. I've been asking around. Nobody knows where she came from, how she got here, nothing. She just showed up 6 months ago with a backpack and a bus ticket. No car, no references, no nothing." "That right?" Dale pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, the wood creaking under his weight. "Mystery woman, huh? I don't like mysteries, Amara. They make me nervous." He gestured to his companions, who spread out around the diner like they were claiming territory. "See my little brother here? He's embarrassed. Got his ass kicked by a girl in front of half the town. That's hard on a man's reputation." The other customers were starting to shift uncomfortably in their seats. A few were reaching for their wallets, preparing to leave, but none of them moved. This was small-town entertainment at its finest. Live drama unfolding over coffee and pie. "I just want to work," Amara said, still focused on the table. "I don't want any trouble." "Work?" Dale laughed, a harsh sound like grinding metal. "Honey, you put 3 grown men in the hospital. That's not the kind of work we do around here." He leaned forward. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize to my brother, right here in front of everyone. Then you're going to pack up your little backpack and get on the next bus out of town. We clear?" Amara set down her rag and looked directly at Dale for the first time. For just a moment, something flickered behind her eyes, something cold and distant and absolutely lethal. But then it was gone, replaced by the tired resignation of someone who'd had this conversation before. "And if I don't?" Dale's smile widened. "Well, then we might have to discuss things outside. And this time it won't be just Tank and his boys. This time, it'll be all of us." He gestured around the room. "Funny thing about small towns, Amara, we take care of our own. And you're not one of our own." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Around the diner, heads nodded in agreement. This was how things worked in Cedar Falls. The Morrisons had been running this town for 3 generations. They owned the auto shop, had fingers in every business from the lumber mill to the trucking company that brought supplies up from Billings. Cross them, and you might find yourself with no place to buy groceries, no one willing to fix your car, no one willing to hire you. Amara understood the dynamic perfectly. She'd seen it in dozens of small communities around the world, from villages in rural Afghanistan to remote outposts in South America. There were always the wolves and the sheep, the predators and the prey, and right now everyone in this room saw her as prey. "I understand," she said finally. "Good girl." Dale stood up, satisfied. "Tank, you want to say something to our friend here?" Tank stepped forward, his chest puffed out with renewed confidence. "Yeah, I got something to say." He leaned down close to Amara, close enough that she could smell the motor oil and cheap cologne that seemed to follow him everywhere. "You got lucky the other night, bitch, but luck runs out, and when it does," Amara interrupted quietly, "we'll see what happens." Tank's face flushed red. "What did you just—" "Boys," Dale's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "I think we've made our point. Amara here knows where she stands now, don't you, sweetheart?" Amara nodded slowly. Around the diner, the other customers were starting to relax, sensing that the show was over. Some even looked disappointed. They'd been hoping for more excitement. "Good," Dale said. "Then we understand each other. You've got until Friday to make your decision. That's 3 days." He dropped a $20 bill on the table. "For the coffee we didn't order." The Morrison crew filed out of the diner like a military unit, Tank bringing up the rear with one last threatening glare in Amara's direction. The bell chimed as the door closed behind them, and slowly conversation resumed. But everyone kept glancing at the quiet dishwasher who'd somehow managed to make enemies of the most dangerous family in Cedar Falls. Maple approached carefully, like someone approaching a wounded animal. "Honey," she said softly, "maybe Dale's right. Maybe it would be better if—" "I know," Amara said, picking up her cleaning rag again. "I know." But what Maple Henderson didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Amara Volkov had been underestimated before. She'd been threatened by warlords and drug cartel leaders, by terrorist commanders and enemy intelligence officers. She'd been cornered in situations that made the Morrison family look like playground bullies. And every single one of those people had learned the same lesson that Tank Morrison was about to learn. Sometimes the sheep turn out to be wolves in disguise. Friday was still 3 days away. That gave her plenty of time to decide exactly how she wanted to handle this situation. The quiet dishwasher wiped down another table and began planning her next move. The first sign that Amara Volkov was more than she appeared came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night when she slipped out of her studio apartment above Maple's diner and disappeared into the shadows of Cedar Falls, like she'd never existed at all. Nobody saw her leave. Nobody heard her footsteps on the metal fire escape that zigzagged down the back of the building. But if someone had been watching, really watching, they might have noticed that she moved differently in the darkness. Gone was the tired shuffle of an overworked dishwasher. In its place was something fluid and predatory, the silent glide of someone who'd learned to navigate hostile territory without disturbing so much as a pebble. She crossed Main Street in the dead zone between streetlights, her form barely a whisper against the shadows cast by the old brick buildings that lined the town's modest commercial district. Past Henley's hardware store, past the First National Bank of Cedar Falls, with its faded Christmas decorations still hanging in the windows, past the rusty Anchor Tavern where Tank Morrison and his crew held court most nights. Amara paused at the corner of Main and Pine, pressing herself against the weathered brick wall of the post office. From here she had a clear line of sight to the Morrison Auto Shop, 3 blocks down Pine Street. The building was dark except for a single security light that cast a pale yellow circle on the gravel parking lot. To anyone else it would have looked completely abandoned. But Amara had been watching the Morrison operation for 6 months, ever since she'd first arrived in Cedar Falls. She knew about the late-night meetings in the back office. She knew about the shipping containers that arrived at the warehouse behind the shop every Thursday at 3 a.m., always with Montana plates but driven by men who spoke with thick Brooklyn accents. She knew about the packages that got transferred from those containers to local delivery trucks, packages that were too heavy to be auto parts and too carefully guarded to be anything legal. She pulled out her phone, not the beat-up Android she carried to work, but a military-grade encrypted device that officially didn't exist. The screen glowed softly as she opened an app that looked like a simple camera, but was actually connected to a network of surveillance satellites that most people didn't know existed. The infrared imaging showed her exactly what she'd expected to see. 3 heat signatures in the auto shop's back office, 2 more in the warehouse, all of them awake and active despite the late hour. Dale Morrison was meeting with his contacts again, which meant another shipment would be arriving soon. Amara had come to Cedar Falls to disappear, to fade away into small-town anonymity and forget about the life she'd left behind. But old habits died hard, especially when those habits had been beaten into you during 8 years of special operations training. She couldn't help but notice patterns. She couldn't help but ask questions. And she definitely couldn't help but investigate when those patterns suggested something bigger than small-town drug dealing. The Morrison family wasn't just running a local operation, they were part of something much larger, much more sophisticated, the kind of operation that had tentacles reaching from the Canadian border down through Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. The kind of operation that the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force had been trying to penetrate for 3 years without success. Amara knew this because despite what everyone in Cedar Falls believed, she wasn't really a dishwasher. She was Lieutenant Commander Amara Volkov, United States Navy, currently on administrative leave pending a classified investigation into an operation that had gone sideways in the mountains of Pakistan 8 months earlier. An operation that had left 3 Navy SEALs dead, and Amara carrying enough guilt to drown a small city. The Navy had offered her a desk job at the Pentagon. The CIA had offered her a position with their Special Activities Division. But Amara had turned them all down. She'd wanted to disappear, to find someplace where nobody knew her name or her reputation. Someplace where she could just exist without having to think about body counts and mission parameters and the weight of decisions that got people killed. Cedar Falls had seemed perfect, a forgotten mountain town where the biggest crime was usually someone stealing beer from the gas and go on the edge of town. A place where she could work with her hands and keep her mouth shut and maybe, eventually, forget about the things she'd seen and done in service to her country. But the Morrison operation had caught her attention almost immediately. Not because she was looking for trouble, but because certain things were impossible to unsee once you'd been trained to see them. The way Dale Morrison's men positioned themselves whenever strangers came to town. The coded language they used on their radios. The fact that their auto shop somehow generated enough income to support 6 full-time employees in a town of 3,200 people. A truck rumbled past on Pine Street, a late-night delivery heading toward the industrial district on the south side of town. Amara tracked its movement automatically, noting the license plate, the make and model, the slight list to the left that suggested an unbalanced load. Another piece of the puzzle she'd been assembling without even meaning to. Her phone buzzed softly, a text message from a number with a Washington, D.C. area code. Status report overdue. Command requests immediate contact. Amara stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. She'd been ignoring similar messages for weeks. Her handler at Naval Intelligence was getting impatient, but Amara wasn't ready to come back in from the cold. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She pocketed the phone and melted back into the shadows, retracing her route toward the diner. But as she moved through the darkness, her mind was already working, processing the information she'd gathered, building profiles and identifying weaknesses in the Morrison operations security. It was automatic, involuntary, like breathing or blinking. She'd been trained to see the world as a chessboard, to identify threats and opportunities, to plan 3 moves ahead of everyone else. Those skills had kept her alive through dozens of missions, in places where American soldiers weren't supposed to be, but they'd also made it impossible for her to ever really switch off, to ever really be just a normal person, working a normal job in a normal town. By the time she reached the diner, Amara had already identified 14 potential entry points into the Morrison compound, mapped out the guard rotation schedule, and calculated exactly how much C4 it would take to bring down their warehouse if the situation ever called for it. She climbed the fire escape to her apartment, moving as silently as she'd descended it an hour earlier. The studio was small and sparse, just a bed, a kitchenette, and a table where she ate her meals alone. But hidden behind a false panel in the bedroom closet was gear that most Special Forces operators would kill for. Night vision goggles, encrypted communication devices, weapons that weren't available to civilian law enforcement. Amara sat on the edge of her bed and stared out the window at the quiet street below. In 3 days, Dale Morrison expected her to be gone. He expected the mysterious dishwasher to pack up her secrets and disappear back into whatever hole she'd crawled out of. What he didn't expect was that his quiet little town had been harboring a weapon of mass destruction in a diner uniform. What he didn't expect was that every threat he'd made, every intimidation tactic he'd used, had been noted and filed away by someone who'd spent years studying the most efficient ways to dismantle criminal organizations. Amara closed her eyes and tried to push the thoughts away. She'd come here to escape this life, not to dive deeper into it. She'd sworn to herself that she was done being a weapon, done being the person that governments pointed at problems they needed to disappear. But some things, once you'd seen them, couldn't be unseen. And some people, once they'd threatened the few good things left in your life, couldn't be ignored. Dale Morrison had given her until Friday to leave town. He'd made it clear that anyone who harbored her, including Maple Henderson, the 67-year-old diner owner who'd given her a job when no one else would face consequences. That had been his first mistake. His second mistake would be assuming that the quiet dishwasher was going to run. To the residents of Cedar Falls, Amara Volkov's story was tragically simple and utterly unremarkable. She'd arrived 6 months ago on a Greyhound bus from somewhere down south. The details were always vague when anyone bothered to ask. She'd rented the studio apartment above Maple's diner, with 3 months cash up front, no questions asked, no references required. Just another drifter washing up in a mountain town that specialized in second chances and forgotten dreams. The official story, the one she'd carefully constructed and maintained, painted her as exactly what Cedar Falls expected. A woman running from something. Maybe an abusive ex-husband, maybe a drug problem, maybe just the kind of bad luck that seemed to follow certain people like storm clouds. She'd grown up in foster care somewhere in Nevada, bounced around between group homes and temporary families who never quite worked out. High school dropout, a few community college classes that never amounted to anything, a string of minimum wage jobs at truck stops and diners across the Southwest. It was a perfectly crafted backstory, boring enough to discourage questions, tragic enough to generate sympathy, common enough to be believable. Maple Henderson had hired her within an hour of meeting her, more out of maternal instinct than business sense. The old woman saw a lost soul who needed saving, and Maple Henderson had never met a lost soul she couldn't fix with hard work and apple pie. Poor thing probably hasn't had a decent meal in months, Maple had confided to her regular customers after Amara's first week. Skinny as a rail and jumpy as a cat in a thunderstorm, but she works harder than any 3 people I've ever hired. Never complains, never shows up late, never asks for advances on her pay. The other employees at the diner, Bobby Chen, the day cook who'd immigrated from Taiwan 30 years earlier, and Sarah Martinez, the part-time waitress who was saving money for nursing school, had accepted Amara with the casual indifference of people who'd learned not to probe too deeply into anyone's past. Cedar Falls was full of people reinventing themselves, starting over, trying to outrun whatever had brought them to the middle of nowhere. Dr. Patricia Reeves, who ran the town's only medical clinic, had treated Amara exactly once, for a minor burn from the diner's grill during her second week on the job. She'd noted the patient's reluctance to remove her long-sleeved shirt, the way she flinched slightly when touched, the carefully neutral expression that never quite reached her eyes. Classic signs of domestic abuse, Dr. Reeves had written in her private notes. Hypervigilant, avoids eye contact, minimal personal history disclosed. Recommended counseling resources, patient declined. Will monitor for additional signs of trauma. What Dr. Reeves had actually observed were the behavioral adaptations of someone who'd spent years operating in hostile territory where a moment's inattention could mean death, where personal information was a weapon that could be used against you, where showing weakness or vulnerability could compromise an entire mission. But in rural Montana, those same traits looked exactly like the aftermath of domestic violence. Pastor Michael Davidson from the Cedar Falls Community Church had tried to reach out during Amara's third month in town. He'd made gentle overtures about joining the congregation, about finding community and healing through faith. Amara had listened politely and declined just as politely, explaining that she preferred to keep to herself while she sorted things out. There's a deep sadness in that young woman, Pastor Davidson had told his wife over dinner, the kind that comes from carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear. I've seen it before in veterans, in women who've escaped abusive situations. She's running from something, but she's also searching for something. I just hope she finds peace before whatever she's running from catches up with her. The pastor's intuition was closer to the truth than he realized, but still missing the most important details. Amara wasn't running from an abusive relationship or a criminal past. She was running from herself, from the person she'd become during 8 years of classified operations, from the weight of decisions that had saved American lives while ending others, from the knowledge that she was exceptionally good at violence in a world that desperately needed her to be something else. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a 20-year veteran of law enforcement, who'd seen Cedar Falls transform from a struggling mining town to a modest tourist destination, had run a background check on Amara during her first month in town. It was routine procedure for anyone who stayed longer than a few weeks, not because he suspected criminal activity, but because small towns survived by knowing who belonged and who didn't. The background check had come back clean. Amara Volkov, born in Reno, Nevada, no criminal record, no outstanding warrants, no red flags. Employment history showed the expected pattern of service industry jobs across Nevada, Utah, and Colorado. Credit history was minimal but clean. No social media presence, no digital footprint beyond the basic necessities. What Sheriff Bradley's check hadn't revealed was that the identity Amara Volkov had been created by the Defense Intelligence Agency's Identity Management Office less than 8 months earlier. The woman using that name had actually been born Amara Catherine Novak in Portland, Oregon, to parents who died in a car accident when she was 16. She'd enlisted in the Navy at 18, been selected for officer candidate school, and had spent the next decade earning commendations that would never appear in any public record. The real tragedy of Amara's situation wasn't what Cedar Falls believed, that she was another victim of circumstance, trying to rebuild her life. The tragedy was that she'd sacrificed everything that made her who she was in service to her country, only to discover that there was no place in civilian society for someone with her particular skills and experiences. She'd tried to reintegrate after her first tour. The Navy had assigned her to a training position at Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek in Virginia Beach. For 6 months, she'd taught survival and evasion techniques to new SEAL candidates, tried to date a fellow officer, attempted to build something resembling a normal life. But normal life felt like sleepwalking after years of hyper-adrenaline operations. Grocery shopping became an exercise in tactical awareness. Dating became impossible when you couldn't discuss anything meaningful about your work. Social interactions felt hollow when you'd spent years in situations where every word carried life or death consequences. So she'd volunteered for deployment again, then again, then again. Each mission took her further from the possibility of a conventional life and deeper into a world where her value was measured entirely by her ability to complete impossible tasks under impossible circumstances. The final mission, the one that had ended with 3 dead SEALs and Amara staring at congressional investigators who wanted to know how an operation with perfect intelligence had gone so catastrophically wrong, had been the breaking point. Not because of the deaths, though those haunted her, but because she'd realized that she'd become exactly what the military had shaped her to become. A perfect weapon with no purpose outside of war. Cedar Falls represented her attempt to prove that theory wrong, to demonstrate that underneath the tactical training and operational experience, there was still a person capable of existing in the normal world. But 6 months of washing dishes and bussing tables had only confirmed what she'd suspected. Once you crossed certain lines, once you'd seen and done certain things, there was no real way back. The Morrison family's threats hadn't just endangered her carefully constructed new life. They'd forced her to confront the fact that she'd been lying to herself about who she was and what she was capable of becoming. Tomorrow was Wednesday. Dale Morrison expected her answer by Friday. But as Amara Volkov lay in her narrow bed above Maple's diner, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sound of mountain wind rattling her windows, she realized that her answer had already been decided the moment Tank Morrison threw his first punch. The quiet dishwasher was about to remind Cedar Falls that some weapons never truly retire. They just wait for the right moment to remember what they were built for. The first time Lieutenant Commander Amara Catherine Novak killed someone, she was 23 years old and crouched in a bombed-out building in Fallujah, watching through her rifle scope as an Iraqi insurgent prepared to detonate an IED that would have killed a convoy of American soldiers. The shot was clean, precise, necessary. Her spotter confirmed the kill, her commanding officer commended her marksmanship, and that night she threw up behind a concrete barrier for 20 minutes until there was nothing left in her stomach but bile and regret. The last time she killed someone, she was 31 years old and standing in a cave complex in the mountains of Pakistan, her sidearm pressed against the temple of a Taliban commander who had just executed 2 of her teammates in front of her eyes. That shot was also clean, precise, and necessary. But she didn't throw up afterward. She didn't feel sick or guilty or even particularly angry. She felt nothing at all, which was when she knew that something fundamental inside her had broken beyond repair. The path between those 2 moments had been carved by the United States Navy's most classified training programs, institutions that existed in the shadows between official military doctrine and the kind of work that democratic governments couldn't publicly acknowledge. Amara had been recruited for the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, better known as SEAL Team 6, not because she was the strongest or fastest candidate, but because she possessed a rare combination of intellectual capability and emotional detachment that made her ideally suited for the military's most sensitive operations. Her training had begun at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, California, but the real education had taken place at facilities that didn't appear on any official maps. Places where she'd learned to speak 4 languages fluently and understand fragments of a dozen others. Where she'd mastered the art of extracting information from unwilling subjects without leaving physical evidence. Where she'd studied the pressure points of the human body with the same intensity that medical students studied anatomy, but for entirely different purposes. By the time she was 25, Amara had been deployed to 17 countries across 4 continents, always undercover identities that were maintained by intelligence agencies that specialized in creating ghosts. She'd infiltrated arms trafficking networks in Bosnia, disrupted terrorist financing operations in Somalia, and eliminated high-value targets in Syria, whose deaths were attributed to internal power struggles rather than American intervention. Her official military record listed her rank as lieutenant commander and her position as administrative liaison, Naval Special Warfare Command. Her actual position was team leader, Direct Action Group 7, a unit that reported directly to the Joint Special Operations Command and operated with presidential authority under a legal framework that most members of Congress weren't aware existed. The mission that had ended her career had begun with intelligence, suggesting that a former Afghan intelligence officer named Rashid Hakim had been selling information about American operations to Pakistani ISI agents. Hakim had been living in a compound near the Pakistani border, protected by local tribal leaders who had been paid enough to ensure his safety. The mission parameters were simple: capture or eliminate Hakim and recover any intelligence he might have compromised. Amara had led a 4-person team into the target area. Herself, Petty Officer First Class Marcus Thompson, Chief Petty Officer David Rodriguez, and Lieutenant Junior Grade Sarah Chen. They were all veterans of dozens of similar operations, professionals who had worked together for 3 years and trusted each other with their lives on a regular basis. The intelligence had been perfect, too perfect, as it turned out. Hakim had been exactly where the briefing materials said he would be. His security detail had been positioned exactly as described. The compound's layout had matched the satellite imagery down to the smallest detail. Everything had proceeded according to plan until Amara's team had breached the main building and discovered that Rashid Hakim had been dead for 2 weeks. The body they found had been arranged to look recently deceased, but Amara's medical training had told her immediately that decomposition was too advanced. Someone had been using Hakim's compound as bait, and her team had walked directly into the trap. The ambush had been executed with military precision. Pakistani Special Services Group commandos had surrounded the compound, cutting off all escape routes. Sniper teams had taken positions on the surrounding ridgelines. Radio jammers had blocked all communication with their extraction team. Marcus Thompson had died first, taken down by a sniper's bullet as he tried to establish overwatch on the compound's eastern wall. David Rodriguez had been killed by an IED planted in the compound's main corridor, a device sophisticated enough to distinguish between local foot traffic and American military boots. Sarah Chen had made it as far as the extraction point before being captured by Pakistani forces. Amara had watched through her night vision scope as Chen was dragged into a building 300 meters from her position. She'd heard the screaming that followed. She'd made the tactical decision to infiltrate the building rather than wait for backup that might never come. What she'd found there had changed her forever. Not just the torture and murder of her teammate, but the realization that the entire mission had been a setup orchestrated by elements within Pakistani intelligence with the knowledge and cooperation of someone in the American chain of command, someone who had access to classified operational details and had used that access to eliminate a team that was getting too close to something they weren't supposed to discover. The Pakistani Taliban commander she'd killed had been in the middle of uploading video of Chen's execution to social media when Amara had found him. His death had been personal, vengeful, and completely outside the rules of engagement that governed American military operations. But it had also given her access to his communication devices, which had contained evidence of a broader conspiracy involving arms trafficking between Pakistani intelligence and American defense contractors, evidence that suggested the Morrison operation in Cedar Falls was just one small piece of a network that stretched across international borders. The congressional investigation that followed had focused on operational failures and intelligence breakdowns. The larger questions about who had compromised the mission and why had been classified at levels that prevented meaningful oversight. Amara had been offered immunity in exchange for her testimony, but she'd also been made to understand that certain details could never be made public. The Navy had wanted to transfer her to a desk position where her knowledge could be contained and monitored. The CIA had offered her a position where her particular skills could continue to be useful, but Amara had recognized that both options were just different forms of the same cage. So she'd chosen disappearance instead. A new identity, a new life, and the hope that she could somehow find a way to exist without the weight of 8 years of classified operations, crushing everything that remained of the person she'd been before the military had shaped her into its perfect weapon. But weapons, once forged, retain their essential nature regardless of how their owners try to repurpose them. And the Morrison family's threats against the people of Cedar Falls had awakened something in Amara that she'd been trying very hard to keep buried. The quiet dishwasher had been an illusion, a performance designed to convince herself, as much as everyone else, that she could be something other than what she'd been trained to become. Dale Morrison had shattered that illusion with his ultimatum, and now Amara was remembering exactly why she'd been considered one of the most effective operators in the history of American Special Forces. The only question was whether Cedar Falls was ready for what that meant. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first shipment had arrived on a Tuesday night in November, 3 weeks after Amara had started working at Maple's Diner. She'd been walking home from her shift when she'd noticed the unusual activity around the Morrison Auto Shop. Too many vehicles, too much movement for a legitimate business operating at 2 a.m. Her trained instincts had kicked in automatically, cataloging details that most people would have dismissed as coincidental. By December, she'd identified the pattern. Every other Thursday between 2:30 and 4 a.m., a convoy of 3 vehicles would arrive at the auto shop's rear warehouse. 2 panel vans with Montana plates and a black Suburban with tinted windows that she'd traced to a rental company in Billings. The same 4 men handled each delivery. 2 drivers who spoke with Brooklyn accents and 2 local handlers who worked for Dale Morrison. The cargo was always transferred quickly, efficiently, with the kind of operational security that spoke to serious criminal enterprise rather than amateur drug dealing. Packages were counted, manifests were checked, and payments were made in cash that was counted under portable LED lights that cast harsh shadows across the warehouse floor. Amara had been observing from concealment for 2 months before she'd identified exactly what the Morrison operation was moving through Cedar Falls. It wasn't drugs, though that would have been simpler to handle. It was military-grade weapons stolen from National Guard armories across the Mountain West and bound for militia groups operating in the Pacific Northwest. The scope of the operation had become clear when she'd managed to photograph serial numbers from several crates during a December delivery. Cross-referencing those numbers through databases she technically no longer had access to had revealed thefts from armories in Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah. Weapons that had been reported missing over the past 18 months. always in quantities small enough to avoid triggering federal investigations, always from facilities with security vulnerabilities that suggested inside knowledge. The Morrison family wasn't just running a local smuggling ring. They were the mountain distribution hub for a network that was arming domestic terrorist groups with military hardware stolen from United States armed forces. The same groups that had been responsible for bombings in Portland, assassination attempts against federal judges in Seattle, and the siege of a Bureau of Land Management office in Idaho that had left 3 federal agents dead. Dale Morrison had positioned himself as the kingpin of a supply chain that was directly contributing to attacks on American law enforcement and civilian targets. His auto shop was a front for an operation that posed a clear and present threat to national security, operating with impunity in a town too small and isolated for effective federal oversight. The intelligence value of the Morrison operation extended far beyond the weapons trafficking. During her surveillance, Amara had identified communication protocols that connected the Cedar Falls hub to similar operations across the region. Phone numbers that traced to militia leaders in Oregon and Washington. Bank accounts that revealed financing from sources connected to foreign intelligence services interested in destabilizing American domestic security. What had started as casual observation born from professional paranoia had evolved into the identification of a significant terrorist support network operating in plain sight. The kind of network that federal law enforcement agencies had been trying to penetrate for years without success, partly because they'd been looking for it in urban areas rather than forgotten mountain towns where everyone minded their own business. The most damning evidence had come 3 weeks ago when Amara had intercepted communications between Dale Morrison and a contact identified as Wolverine 6. The conversation, recorded using equipment she'd retrieved from a cache hidden in the mountains outside town, had detailed plans for a major weapons transfer scheduled for the last week of December. 200 assault rifles, 40,000 rounds of ammunition, and enough C4 explosive to bring down a federal building. The timing wasn't coincidental. December 30th marked the anniversary of the Ruby Ridge incident, a date that had become sacred to militia movements across the country. Intelligence reports from her former colleagues had indicated increased chatter about a significant action planned for that date, something intended to demonstrate the reach and capability of anti-government groups. The Morrison operation was preparing to supply weapons for what appeared to be a coordinated domestic terrorism event targeting federal facilities across multiple states, an event that would likely result in significant civilian casualties and could potentially trigger the kind of government crackdown that militia groups had been trying to provoke for decades. Amara had spent the past 3 weeks debating whether to report her findings to federal authorities. Her former handler at Naval Intelligence had been trying to contact her for months, offering reinstatement and full protection if she would return to active duty. The FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force would have been intensely interested in her intelligence, especially given her unique access to the Morrison operation. But reporting her findings would have required revealing her own identity and operational capabilities. It would have meant abandoning her attempt to build a normal life and returning to a world where she existed only as a weapon pointed at whatever target the government deemed necessary. More importantly, it would have meant placing everyone in Cedar Falls at risk during the federal investigation that would follow. Small-town operations like the Morrison Network survived by maintaining deep roots in their local communities. Dale Morrison wasn't just a criminal, he was a local employer, a town council member, and a third-generation Cedar Falls resident whose family had been part of the community's power structure since the 1950s. Any federal investigation would tear the town apart, destroying innocent lives alongside guilty ones. The alternative was to handle the situation personally, using her unique skills to neutralize the threat without involving federal agencies or exposing the broader community to the consequences of a high-profile terrorism investigation. It would mean stepping back into the role she'd been trying to escape, but it would also mean protecting people who had shown her kindness when she'd needed it most. The decision had been made for her when Dale Morrison had threatened Maple Henderson and given her an ultimatum that forced her hand. The moment he'd brought innocent civilians into his operational planning, he'd transformed from a criminal problem into a tactical target. Amara had spent the past 48 hours conducting detailed reconnaissance of the Morrison compound, identifying security vulnerabilities and escape routes, mapping guard rotations and communication protocols. She'd retrieved equipment from caches hidden throughout the mountains, gear that she'd placed during her first weeks in Cedar Falls as standard operational procedure, insurance against exactly the kind of situation she now faced. Tonight, she would begin the process of systematically dismantling the Morrison operation using methods learned during years of counterterrorism operations in hostile territory. She would start with their communications network, then their financial infrastructure, then their personnel. By the time she was finished, Dale Morrison's weapons trafficking network would be completely destroyed, its leadership eliminated, and its intelligence value harvested for use against similar operations. The quiet dishwasher had been a carefully constructed fiction, a role played by someone trying to convince herself that she could be something other than what she'd been trained to become. But Dale Morrison's threats had shattered that illusion, forcing her to acknowledge that some responsibilities couldn't be abandoned just because they were inconvenient or psychologically damaging. Cedar Falls was about to discover that their newest resident wasn't running from her past. She was about to use it to save their future, whether they understood it or not. The real Amara Volkov was finally ready to come out of hiding. Wednesday night fell over Cedar Falls like a curtain drawn across a stage, transforming the sleepy mountain town into something entirely different. The streetlights cast long shadows between buildings that had stood since the 1940s, and the winter wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke from chimneys scattered across the residential districts that climbed the hillsides like terraced gardens. Amara moved through this transformed landscape with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years operating in hostile territory. She'd changed into clothing that would have looked unremarkable to any casual observer: dark jeans, hiking boots, a navy wool sweater that provided warmth without restricting movement. But every item had been selected for tactical considerations that went far beyond fashion. The jeans were reinforced at stress points and designed to allow full range of motion. The boots had specialized soles that provided traction on multiple surfaces while minimizing noise. The sweater was made from merino wool that wouldn't retain odors and could regulate body temperature across a wide range of conditions. Her first target was the Morrison Operations Communication Hub, a modified radio antenna array hidden on the roof of their auto shop and disguised as standard commercial broadcasting equipment. Amara had identified the array during her reconnaissance, recognizing the specialized configuration that indicated encrypted digital communication capability rather than simple voice radio. Accessing the auto shop required navigating security measures that Dale Morrison had implemented with the paranoid thoroughness of someone who understood that his operation had attracted federal attention. Motion sensors covered the primary approaches to the building, while strategically positioned surveillance cameras monitored all potential entry points. A simple alarm system might have deterred amateur thieves, but Morrison had invested in military-grade security that would challenge even experienced professionals. Amara approached the building from the north, where the slope of the hillside provided natural concealment and allowed her to bypass the perimeter sensors entirely. She'd spent hours studying the facility's electrical grid, identifying the junction boxes and power distribution points that fed the security system. Her route took her through a drainage culvert that ran beneath Pine Street, emerging at a utility access point that was invisible from ground level but provided direct access to the building's infrastructure. The lock on the utility panel surrendered to her picks in less than 30 seconds, not because it was poorly designed, but because lockpicking was a skill she'd been practicing since her first deployment to Eastern Europe, where electronic security systems were often less reliable than mechanical ones. Inside the panel, she identified the circuits that powered the surveillance network and the motion detection grid, but rather than simply cutting power, which would have triggered backup systems and alerted Morrison's security team, Amara made subtle modifications to the electrical supply that would cause the equipment to malfunction gradually over the next several hours. Voltage fluctuations that would appear to be normal power grid instabilities, but would systematically degrade the performance of surveillance cameras and sensors until they became effectively useless. With the security grid compromised, she moved to her primary objective, the communication array on the building's roof. Scaling the exterior wall required techniques she'd learned during urban warfare training, using building features and architectural details to create handholds and support points that allowed her to ascend without specialized climbing equipment. The antenna array was more sophisticated than she'd expected, incorporating signal processing equipment that suggested Morrison's operation was capable of intercepting and decoding federal law enforcement communications. This wasn't just a smuggling ring, it was an intelligence-gathering operation that had been monitoring FBI and DEA activities across the region, which explained how they'd avoided detection for so long. Amara attached monitoring devices to key components of the array, hardware that would allow her to intercept the Morrison network's communications while remaining completely undetectable to their technical security measures. The devices were products of research and development programs that existed in the classified budgets of intelligence agencies, technology that was years ahead of anything available to civilian law enforcement. With the communication intercept established, she turned her attention to the physical evidence stored in the warehouse behind the auto shop. The building's rear entrance was protected by a lock that would have challenged most professionals, but Amara's training had included instruction from specialists who could defeat any security measure that relied on mechanical principles rather than electronic ones. The warehouse interior revealed the full scope of Morrison's operation. Wooden crates stacked along the walls bore stenciled markings that identified their contents as military surplus, but Amara's examination revealed weapons and equipment that had been stolen from active military installations rather than legitimately decommissioned. Night vision devices that were still classified as restricted technology, communication equipment that was supposed to be destroyed after specific operational lifespans, explosives with serial numbers that traced to recent thefts from National Guard armories. She moved through the warehouse methodically, photographing everything with a camera that could capture images in complete darkness while maintaining the kind of detail that would satisfy intelligence analysts back at Langley. Serial numbers, shipping manifests, communication protocols written on index cards and taped to equipment cases, all of it documented with the thoroughness that had made her one of the most effective intelligence operatives in recent Navy history. But photography wasn't her only objective. Hidden among the legitimate-looking auto parts and repair equipment, she placed tracking devices that would allow her to monitor the movement of vehicles and personnel associated with the Morrison operation. Microscopic transmitters that would provide real-time location data while remaining undetectable to standard counter-surveillance sweeps. The most valuable intelligence came from Morrison's office, located in a converted storage room that had been equipped with the kind of secure communication equipment that suggested direct contact with federal law enforcement sources. A computer terminal that was connected to databases she recognized from her own operational experience. Radio equipment configured to monitor frequencies used by agencies that weren't supposed to exist in official documentation. Dale Morrison wasn't just trafficking stolen weapons. He was operating with protection from someone inside the federal law enforcement community, someone who had access to classified operational intelligence and was using that access to keep the Morrison network one step ahead of legitimate investigations. Copying the contents of Morrison's computer required specialized equipment that Amara had retrieved from her mountain cache, devices that could extract data while leaving no trace of unauthorized access. The process took 47 minutes, time she spent monitoring communication frequencies and identifying the call signs and encryption protocols used by Morrison's network. When she finally extracted from the warehouse, Amara possessed comprehensive intelligence on a domestic terrorism support network that extended far beyond Cedar Falls. Names, addresses, financial accounts, and communication protocols for militia groups across 4 states. Evidence of federal law enforcement corruption that reached into agencies responsible for national security. Documentation of planned attacks that would coincide with the December 30th anniversary date. But more importantly, she now understood that her arrival in Cedar Falls hadn't been the coincidence she'd believed. Someone had been tracking her movements since her departure from active duty, and her presence in this specific town had been part of a larger operational plan that she was only beginning to comprehend. The quiet dishwasher had been performing a role in someone else's operation, and Dale Morrison's ultimatum had forced her to step outside that role at exactly the moment when her handlers had expected her to remain passive and invisible. Tomorrow would bring consequences that would transform Cedar Falls forever. But tonight, Amara had gathered the intelligence necessary to understand who her real enemies were and exactly how she intended to destroy them. The weapon was fully loaded, and the target had been acquired. Thursday morning arrived in Cedar Falls with the kind of crystalline winter clarity that made the surrounding mountains look close enough to touch. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, coating every surface with a layer of frost that sparkled like diamond dust in the early sunlight. Main Street was nearly deserted, except for the usual morning commuters heading to jobs at the lumber mill and the handful of businesses that kept the town's economy functioning. Amara stood behind the counter at Maple's Diner, pouring coffee for the breakfast crowd and maintaining the same quiet, unremarkable demeanor that had defined her 6 months in Cedar Falls. But everything had changed in the space of a single night. The intelligence she'd gathered from the Morrison compound had revealed a situation far more dangerous and complex than she'd initially understood. The computer files she'd copied contained communication logs that traced Morrison's network connections to federal agencies that shouldn't have existed in any official organizational chart. References to Operation Sleeping Bear, a classified domestic surveillance program that had supposedly been terminated following congressional oversight investigations 3 years earlier. Financial records showing payments from accounts linked to defense contractors who specialized in psychological warfare and domestic intelligence operations. Most damning of all, she'd discovered her own operational files stored in Morrison's secure database, not the fabricated identity of Amara Volkov, dishwasher and drifter, but her real service record as Lieutenant Commander Amara Catherine Novak, including mission summaries, psychological evaluations, and assessment reports that should have been accessible only to personnel with the highest levels of security clearance. Someone within the intelligence community had been tracking her movements since her departure from active duty. Her arrival in Cedar Falls hadn't been random escape. It had been orchestrated, part of a larger operation that required her specific skills and psychological profile. The Morrison weapons trafficking network wasn't just a criminal enterprise. It was bait designed to eventually draw her into a situation where she would be forced to reveal her true capabilities. The question was whether her handlers had anticipated Dale Morrison's ultimatum, or whether his threats against the local community had disrupted a more subtle operational timeline. Either way, Amara found herself in the familiar position of being a weapon deployed by people who viewed her as an expendable asset rather than a human being with agency and choice. The bell above the diner's front door chimed at exactly 8:47 a.m., and Tank Morrison entered with the swagger of someone who believed intimidation was a substitute for intelligence. He was followed by three men Amara didn't recognize, outsiders with the kind of military bearing that suggested professional security contractors rather than local muscle. Their presence meant that Dale Morrison had escalated beyond his usual operational parameters, bringing in specialists for whatever he had planned for Friday's deadline. "Morning, sunshine," Tank announced loudly enough for the entire diner to hear. "Hope you're enjoying your last day in paradise." The breakfast crowd, mostly local ranchers and truck drivers, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Maple Henderson emerged from the kitchen, her face set in the expression of someone who dealt with troublemakers for 40 years and wasn't impressed by Tank Morrison's theatrical display. "Tank, I told you yesterday that I don't want this kind of drama in my place," Maple said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd raised 4 sons without backup. "If you can't behave like a civilized human being, you can take your business elsewhere." "Relax, Maple," Tank replied, sliding onto a bar stool directly in front of Amara. "Just came in for coffee and conversation with my favorite dishwasher." He gestured to his companions who spread out around the diner in positions that blocked the exits, a tactical deployment that confirmed their professional training. Amara poured coffee into a mug and placed it on the counter in front of Tank, her movements calm and deliberate. But her peripheral vision was cataloging the positioning of Morrison's team, identifying potential weapons, calculating angles of attack and defensive positions. The familiar mental processes that had kept her alive through dozens of hostile encounters were activating automatically, despite her conscious effort to maintain the dishwasher persona. "Dale wants to make sure you understand the situation," Tank continued, adding sugar to his coffee with exaggerated casualness. "See, we've been asking around about you. Turns out nobody in Cedar Falls really knows anything about Amara Volkov. No friends back home, no family trying to contact you, no social media presence. It's like you just appeared out of thin air 6 months ago." One of the contractors, a lean man with graying temples and the kind of alert stillness that marked him as former special operations, had positioned himself near the kitchen entrance where he could observe both the dining area and the rear exit. His jacket was cut to conceal a shoulder holster, and he wore the kind of tactical boots that provided traction on multiple surfaces. "That's interesting, don't you think?" Tank pressed, leaning forward across the counter. "Woman with no past, no connections, no trace of existing before she showed up in our little town. Makes a person wonder what kind of secrets she might be hiding." The second contractor had taken position near the front windows, where he could monitor the street while maintaining visual contact with his team. His positioning suggested military training focused on close protection and extraction operations, the kind of specialist who would be assigned to high-value targets in hostile territory. "Of course, secrets have a way of coming out," Tank continued, his voice taking on a more menacing tone. "Especially when people start asking the right questions to the right people. You'd be amazed what you can learn about someone when you know where to look." Amara continued wiping down the counter, her expression neutral, but her mind was processing the tactical implications of Morrison's escalation. The presence of professional contractors meant that her surveillance of their operation had been detected, which suggested either sophisticated counter-surveillance capabilities or intelligence provided by federal sources. The timing of their confrontation, less than 12 hours after her infiltration of their warehouse, indicated that her activities had triggered operational protocols designed to contain potential security breaches. The third contractor was the most dangerous of the group. Positioned near the diner's rear booth, he had clear lines of sight to all potential threats, while maintaining access to multiple exit routes. His hands rested casually on the table, but Amara recognized the positioning that would allow him to draw and fire in under 2 seconds. More importantly, his eyes never left her, not with the casual interest of someone watching a conversation, but with the focused attention of a professional who'd been briefed on a specific target. "Friday's still the deadline," Tank announced, finishing his coffee and standing up. "But Dale wanted me to deliver a message about what happens if you decide to be stubborn." He reached into his jacket and placed a photograph on the counter, a surveillance image of Maple Henderson walking to her car in the diner's parking lot. The image had been taken with telephoto lens from an elevated position, probably the roof of the building across the street. The angle and composition suggested professional surveillance equipment and training in covert photography. But more importantly, it represented a direct threat against an innocent civilian who had shown Amara kindness when she'd needed it most. "Lots of things can happen in a small town," Tank continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Amara could hear. "House fires, car accidents, random violence from strangers passing through. Be a real shame if something happened to folks who got caught in the middle of other people's problems." The photograph changed everything. Morrison's threats had moved beyond intimidation to direct operational planning against civilian targets. The contractors weren't just security. They were the advance team for whatever action Morrison had planned, if she refused to leave town quietly. But more importantly, the surveillance photograph proved that Morrison's operation had capabilities that went far beyond local criminal enterprise. The equipment and personnel required for professional target surveillance suggested backing from federal agencies or private military contractors with government connections. Tank picked up the photograph and slid it back into his jacket. "Friday noon, bus station. Don't make this more complicated than it needs to be." As Morrison's team filed out of the diner, Amara made the final calculations that would determine her course of action. Morrison had escalated to direct threats against civilians, which meant that quiet extraction was no longer possible. His possession of her real service record meant that this confrontation had been planned by people with access to classified intelligence databases. Most importantly, the professional quality of his security team meant that she was facing opponents who understood exactly what they were dealing with. Not a dishwasher trying to hide from her past, but a Navy SEAL with 8 years of combat experience and no remaining loyalty to the agencies that had shaped her into a weapon. The quiet dishwasher had been a performance designed to convince herself that she could escape what she'd become, but Dale Morrison's escalation had forced her to acknowledge that some battles couldn't be avoided through patience or diplomacy. Tomorrow would be Friday. Morrison expected her to be on a bus out of town. Instead, he was about to discover what happened when you threatened the only people who'd shown kindness to someone who'd forgotten how to live without violence. The weapon was about to be deployed, and this time, Amara Volkov was choosing her own targets. Friday arrived in Cedar Falls with the kind of oppressive stillness that preceded mountain storms, though the weather forecast called for clear skies and bitter cold. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees below zero overnight, turning exhaled breath into crystalline clouds and making every step on the frozen sidewalks sound like breaking glass. Main Street was deserted except for a few die-hard locals heading to work despite the dangerous cold, their movements hurried and purposeful. At exactly 11:45 a.m., 15 minutes before Dale Morrison's deadline, Amara Volkov walked out of Maple's diner for the last time. She carried the same threadbare canvas backpack that had accompanied her to work every day for 6 months, but its contents had been carefully selected for purposes that had nothing to do with washing dishes or bussing tables. Hidden beneath a layer of innocuous personal items were devices that most civilian law enforcement agencies had never seen, tools developed by military research programs that existed in the classified margins of defense budgets. She walked north on Main Street, past the hardware store and the bank, past the post office where Mrs. Patterson was struggling with frozen locks on the mail collection boxes. To any casual observer, she looked exactly like what Dale Morrison expected to see, a defeated woman heading to the bus station with everything she owned, driven out of town by threats she was powerless to resist. The Greyhound station occupied a converted gas station at the intersection of Main Street and Highway 12, a modest building with a waiting area that could accommodate maybe 20 people and a ticket counter that was staffed only when buses were scheduled to arrive or depart. The next bus to Billings wasn't due until 2:15 p.m., but Amara's presence at noon would demonstrate compliance with Morrison's ultimatum while providing her with tactical advantages that he wouldn't recognize until it was too late. Dale Morrison was already waiting when she arrived, flanked by his brother Tank and the 3 contractors who'd made their presence known at the diner the previous morning. They'd positioned themselves with the kind of tactical awareness that suggested military training, controlling sight lines, maintaining communication distances, and ensuring multiple exit routes. But their positioning also revealed assumptions about Amara's capabilities that were about to prove catastrophically incorrect. "Smart girl," Dale announced as she approached the station entrance. "For a minute there, I thought we might have to do this the hard way." Amara stopped 10 feet from Morrison's group, close enough for conversation but far enough to maintain tactical options. Her backpack rested casually on one shoulder, secured by straps that could be released in less than a second. To Morrison's team, she looked nervous and defeated, exactly the reaction they'd expected from a civilian being forced out of her home by professional intimidation. "Before I leave," Amara said, her voice carrying the same quiet resignation that had characterized her interactions with Morrison's family for the past week, "I want to know why you really want me gone." Dale Morrison smiled with the satisfaction of someone who believed the game was over. "Like I told you before, sweetheart, you don't fit in here. Cedar Falls is a tight community, and we take care of our own." "Is that why you've been running stolen military weapons through your warehouse?" Amara asked, her tone conversational, almost curious. "Taking care of the community by arming domestic terrorist groups?" The change in Morrison's expression was immediate and dramatic. The casual confidence vanished, replaced by the alert wariness of someone who just realized that the situation wasn't what he'd believed it to be. His hand moved automatically toward the weapon concealed beneath his jacket, but stopped when he noticed that Amara hadn't moved at all. "I don't know what you think you know," Morrison said carefully, "but you're making a big mistake." "Am I?" Amara shifted her weight slightly, a movement so subtle that Morrison's contractors didn't recognize it as the first stage of a combat stance that had been drilled into her muscle memory through thousands of hours of training. "Because I've spent the past 6 months documenting your entire operation. Weapons shipments, communication protocols, financial networks, personnel rosters, everything." Tank Morrison stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and confusion. "Dale, what the hell is she talking about?" but Dale was studying Amara with the focused attention of someone who'd suddenly realized that he was facing a threat he'd completely misunderstood. "Who are you, really?" "Lieutenant Commander Amara Catherine Novak, United States Navy," she replied, dropping the exhausted resignation from her voice and replacing it with the crisp authority that had once commanded special operations teams in hostile territory. "Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Team 7, and you've just confessed to federal crimes in the presence of someone with the authority to place you under citizen's arrest." The revelation hit Morrison's group like a physical blow. Tank actually took a step backward, his mouth opening and closing without producing sound. The contractors immediately shifted into defensive positions, their hands moving to weapons that were suddenly inadequate for the situation they found themselves facing. "You're military," Dale said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Former military," Amara corrected. "Currently unemployed, but still sworn to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic." She smiled, but there was nothing friendly about the expression. "That includes arms dealers who supply weapons to groups that target federal law enforcement officers." The lead contractor, the gray-haired man who'd positioned himself near the kitchen entrance at the diner, finally found his voice. "Dale, we need to extract. Now." But Dale Morrison was beyond rational thought. 6 months of believing that he was intimidating a helpless civilian had been shattered in the space of 30 seconds, replaced by the understanding that he'd been threatening a Navy SEAL who'd been gathering intelligence on his operation since the day she'd arrived in town. "You've been watching us," he said. "Every move," Amara confirmed. "Every shipment, every communication, every contact with your militia buyers in Oregon and Washington. I know about Operation Sleeping Bear. I know about your federal protection. I know about the December 30th weapons transfer that's supposed to supply the anniversary attacks." Tank Morrison lunged forward, driven by rage and panic rather than tactical thinking. "You lying bitch! You're just a dishwasher!" What happened next took exactly 1.7 seconds. Amara's backpack hit the ground as she stepped inside Tank's charge, her left hand deflecting his wild swing while her right delivered a precise strike to the cluster of nerve endings just below his ear. Tank's 280 pounds of muscle became dead weight that crashed into the snow-covered pavement like a falling tree. The first contractor was drawing his weapon when Amara's boot connected with his knee, hyper-extending the joint with an audible pop that echoed off the surrounding buildings. He screamed and collapsed, his sidearm flying across the icy pavement. The second contractor managed to clear his holster before Amara reached him, but his tactical training hadn't prepared him for someone who moved like liquid lightning and struck with surgical precision. Her elbow shattered his wrist, sending his weapon spinning into the snow. Before he could recover, her knee found his solar plexus, and he joined his colleague on the ground. The gray-haired contractor was backing toward his vehicle, his own weapon drawn but not aimed, when Amara spoke in the tone she'd once used to halt enemy combatants in active war zones. "Don't." He froze, his finger on the trigger, staring at a woman who'd just incapacitated 3 armed men in under 2 seconds without breathing hard or showing any sign of exertion. Dale Morrison was reaching for his own weapon when Amara's attention turned to him. She covered the distance between them in a single fluid movement, her hand clamping around his wrist with enough pressure to make his fingers go numb. "The smart move," she said quietly, "would be to drop the gun." Morrison's weapon fell into the snow with a muffled thud. "Now," Amara continued, maintaining her grip on his wrist while scanning the area for additional threats, "you're going to tell me exactly who's been protecting your operation, and you're going to do it before I decide that you're more valuable dead than alive." The quiet dishwasher was gone. In her place stood someone who'd spent 8 years learning to be the most dangerous person in any room, and Dale Morrison was about to discover exactly what that meant for his future. The weapon had been deployed, and the target was completely outmatched. The aftermath of the confrontation at the Greyhound station unfolded with the kind of systematic precision that characterized military operations in hostile territory. Within 90 minutes of Dale Morrison's arrest, Cedar Falls had been transformed from a sleepy mountain town into the center of a federal investigation that would dominate headlines across the Mountain West for months to come. The first federal agents arrived by helicopter at 1:47 p.m., landing in the parking lot of Cedar Falls High School in a Blackhawk that bore no official markings but carried the kind of specialized communication equipment that identified it as belonging to the Joint Special Operations Command. The team that disembarked moved with the coordinated efficiency of professionals who'd conducted similar operations in active combat zones, securing the Morrison compound and establishing a command post that could coordinate with federal agencies across multiple jurisdictions. Amara had spent the intervening time securing the crime scene and ensuring that critical evidence remained untampered with until proper chain of custody procedures could be established. The weapons and intelligence gathered from Morrison's warehouse would require analysis by specialists who understood the implications of arms trafficking networks that extended across international borders, but the immediate priority was preventing the scheduled weapons transfer that had been planned for December 30th. The interrogation of Dale Morrison had yielded intelligence that validated Amara's assessment of the operation's scope and sophistication. Morrison's trafficking network extended from arms thefts at military installations in Colorado to delivery points in Oregon where militia groups were preparing for coordinated attacks on federal facilities. The December 30th anniversary operation would have supplied enough firepower to target FBI field offices, federal courthouses, and Bureau of Land Management facilities across the Pacific Northwest. More significantly, Morrison's confession had revealed the identity of his federal protection source, Deputy Assistant Director Marcus Webb of the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Division, who had been using his access to classified intelligence to keep Morrison's network one step ahead of legitimate investigations. Webb's corruption had compromised federal law enforcement operations across the region, allowing domestic terrorist groups to operate with impunity while targeting the same agencies that should have been investigating them. The arrest of Webb at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., had triggered a broader investigation into corruption within federal law enforcement agencies responsible for domestic security. Congressional oversight committees were demanding briefings on how a senior FBI official had been able to protect arms trafficking operations for over 2 years without detection. Intelligence agencies were conducting damage assessments to determine what other operations might have been compromised by Webb's activities. But the most immediate consequence of the Morrison arrests was the disruption of weapons transfers that had been scheduled to supply domestic terrorist operations across multiple states. Federal raids conducted simultaneously in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho had netted the seizure of enough military-grade weapons to supply a small army, along with intelligence that led to the identification and arrest of militia leaders who had been planning attacks on civilian targets. Sheriff Tom Bradley, who had been investigating unusual activity around the Morrison compound for months without understanding its true scope, found himself coordinating with federal agencies that operated with authorities he'd never encountered in 20 years of law enforcement. The transformation of his jurisdiction from a routine rural patrol beat into the center of a national security investigation had required him to adapt quickly to protocols and procedures that normally applied only to active war zones. "I've been sheriff here for 2 decades," Bradley told the federal agents who'd established their command post in his office. And I never imagined we were sitting on something like this. Dale Morrison was always involved in questionable activities, but arms trafficking to domestic terrorists, that's beyond anything I was trained to handle. The federal investigation had revealed that Morrison's operation was part of a larger network that the FBI had been trying to penetrate for 3 years without success. The intelligence gathered by Amara during her 6 months of surveillance had provided the breakthrough that federal agencies needed to dismantle domestic terrorist infrastructure that extended across 11 states and involved over 200 active participants. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who had been assigned to coordinate the federal response to the Morrison investigation, had reviewed Amara's intelligence gathering with the kind of professional admiration reserved for operations that exceeded standard performance parameters. "What you accomplished here," Walsh told Amara during their debriefing session at the federal command post, "represents the most comprehensive penetration of domestic terrorist networks that we've achieved in recent years. Your intelligence has given us the capability to prevent attacks that would have killed federal law enforcement officers and civilian targets." The offer of reinstatement had come directly from the Pentagon, delivered by a general officer who'd flown to Cedar Falls specifically to meet with Amara and discuss her return to active duty. The Navy was prepared to restore her full rank and security clearances, assign her to the most classified counterterrorism operations, and provide whatever support she needed to continue the work that had led to the Morrison Network's destruction. "Your country needs officers with your capabilities," General Patricia Morrison had explained during their private meeting at the federal command post. "The threats we face from domestic terrorist groups require exactly the kind of skills and experience that you've demonstrated here. You could lead operations that would save American lives on a scale that most people can't comprehend." But Amara's response had surprised everyone involved in the federal investigation. "Thank you for the offer," she'd told General Morrison, "but I'm not interested in returning to active duty." The decision had been made during the previous night while she'd sat in her studio apartment above Maple's Diner and listened to the sound of federal helicopters conducting surveillance flights over the mountains that surrounded Cedar Falls. She'd realized that her 6 months of trying to escape her past had actually been preparation for a different kind of future, one that involved using her skills to protect people on a more personal scale, rather than as a weapon deployed by agencies that viewed her as an expendable asset. Maple Henderson had offered her a partnership in the diner, recognition of the fact that Amara had risked everything to protect the community that had become her home. Sheriff Bradley had suggested that she consider a position with his department, where her investigative capabilities could be applied to problems that affected people's daily lives rather than abstract national security objectives. "For the first time in my adult life," Amara had explained to General Morrison, "I have the opportunity to choose what I want to protect and how I want to protect it. I'm not interested in going back to a world where those decisions are made for me by people who've never seen the consequences of their orders." The federal investigation would continue for months, unraveling the complete scope of domestic terrorist networks that the Morrison operation had supported. Congressional hearings would examine how federal agencies had failed to detect corruption within their own ranks. Intelligence agencies would implement new protocols to prevent similar security breaches. But for Amara Volkov, the most important outcome was simpler. She'd found a place where she belonged, people who valued her for who she was rather than what she could do, and a purpose that didn't require her to sacrifice her humanity in service to abstract strategic objectives. The quiet dishwasher had been a performance, but the person she'd become in Cedar Falls was real. For the first time since enlisting in the Navy 15 years earlier, Lieutenant Commander Amara Catherine Novak was choosing to be someone other than a weapon. The transformation was complete, and the weapon had chosen to become something else entirely. 6 months after the destruction of the Morrison weapons trafficking network, Cedar Falls had settled into a new rhythm that acknowledged both the extraordinary events that had transformed the town and the ordinary life that continued despite them. The federal investigation had concluded with congressional commendations and intelligence community reforms, but for the residents of this mountain community, the most significant change was far more personal. The quiet dishwasher had become someone they could depend on in ways that went far beyond serving coffee and clearing tables. Amara stood behind the expanded counter of what was now called Maple and Amara's Diner, watching the breakfast crowd that had grown to include federal agents conducting follow-up investigations, journalists writing feature stories about domestic terrorism in rural America, and curious tourists who'd heard about the Navy SEAL waitress through social media coverage that had made Cedar Falls temporarily famous. The attention was unwelcome but manageable, especially since most visitors left disappointed when they discovered that the woman they'd come to see looked exactly like someone who belonged behind a diner counter in a forgotten mountain town. The partnership with Maple Henderson had evolved into something more meaningful than either woman had expected. Maple's maternal instincts and Amara's operational discipline had created an establishment that served as both restaurant and unofficial community center, a place where residents could gather to discuss everything from local politics to federal law enforcement policies without worrying about who might be listening or what information might be reported to outside authorities. "You know," Maple said as she emerged from the kitchen, carrying plates of eggs and bacon for the ranchers who started their mornings at 5:30 a.m., regardless of weather or circumstances. "I never thought I'd be running a business that gets visited by FBI agents and congressional investigators on a regular basis. But I've got to admit, the tips are better than they used to be." The transformation of Cedar Falls had attracted attention from federal agencies that specialized in rural security issues, leading to the establishment of a regional liaison office that coordinated communication between local law enforcement and federal counterterrorism operations. Sheriff Tom Bradley had found himself consulting with experts from agencies he'd never heard of, learning about threats and security protocols that had previously been confined to urban areas and international borders. "What happened here?" Bradley had explained to a congressional subcommittee during testimony about rural domestic terrorism, demonstrated that threats to national security can emerge in communities where we least expect them, but it also proved that those same communities have resources and capabilities that federal agencies often overlook when they're developing security strategies. The congressional hearings had resulted in legislative reforms that mandated better coordination between federal and local law enforcement agencies, particularly in rural areas where domestic terrorist groups had been recruiting and organizing without effective oversight. The Morrison case had become a textbook example of how federal bureaucracy and jurisdictional conflicts could allow serious threats to develop in plain sight of multiple agencies that never shared information effectively. But for Amara, the most meaningful changes had been personal rather than political. Tank Morrison, who had spent 4 months in federal custody before being released on probation, had returned to Cedar Falls a different person. The arrogance and casual violence that had defined his public persona had been replaced by a wariness that suggested genuine understanding of how close he'd come to consequences that would have destroyed his life completely. He'd approached her during a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the diner was nearly empty and conversation was possible without drawing attention from other customers or federal agents who still maintained a discreet presence in the area. "I wanted to apologize," he'd said, standing awkwardly near the counter like someone who wasn't sure whether his presence was welcome. "Not because my lawyer told me to or because it might help with my probation, because I was wrong about you and I was wrong about what I thought gave me the right to treat people the way I did." The conversation had lasted 20 minutes, during which Tank had revealed details about his family's operation that explained how a third-generation Cedar Falls resident had become involved in arms trafficking to domestic terrorist groups, economic pressure, federal regulations that had made traditional industries less profitable, and the gradual erosion of opportunities for young men without college educations had created conditions where Dale Morrison's criminal enterprises had seemed like legitimate business development. "I'm not making excuses," Tank had said. "I'm just trying to understand how we got to a place where selling weapons to people who wanted to kill federal agents seemed like a reasonable way to make a living." Amara had listened without judgment, recognizing that Tank's confession represented the kind of insight that federal investigators rarely gathered during formal interrogations. The personal motivations that drove ordinary people toward domestic terrorism were often more complex and tragic than the ideological frameworks that dominated congressional hearings and intelligence assessments. The conversation had ended with Tank's request to work at the diner, not for money but as a form of community service that would allow him to contribute something positive to the town that his family had endangered. Maple had been skeptical, but Amara had recognized an opportunity to demonstrate that people could change when they were given alternatives to the destructive patterns that had defined their previous choices. The most dangerous people in any room, Amara had told a gathering of federal law enforcement officers during a training session about rural counterterrorism, are never the ones who announce their intentions or demonstrate their capabilities through obvious displays of aggression. They're the ones who observe, who listen, who understand their environment well enough to identify opportunities that others miss. The training sessions had become a regular part of Amara's new life, sharing lessons learned during 8 years of special operations with federal agents who were responsible for preventing domestic terrorism in communities that often viewed federal law enforcement as an occupying force rather than a protective presence. But the most important lesson she'd learned in Cedar Falls had nothing to do with tactical procedures or intelligence-gathering techniques. It was about the difference between being a weapon deployed by others and being a person who chose how to use her capabilities in service of values she'd selected for herself. "Strength isn't about being seen," she'd explained to a group of young women who'd asked her to speak at Cedar Falls High School about careers in military service. "It's not about proving that you're more capable or more dangerous than the people around you. Real strength is about knowing when to act and when to wait, when to fight and when to build, when to be feared and when to be trusted." The quiet girl they'd mocked had never existed. What they'd encountered was someone who'd chosen to be underestimated because it served her purposes, someone who'd learned that the most effective power was often invisible until the moment it needed to be deployed. But the person who remained in Cedar Falls after the federal investigation concluded was neither the dishwasher nor the Navy SEAL. She was someone who'd discovered that the choice between being a weapon and being a person was false, that it was possible to retain lethal capabilities while using them in service of protection rather than destruction, of building communities rather than eliminating targets. The world was full of people who judged others by surface appearances, who mistook silence for weakness and stillness for fear. But the most dangerous mistake was assuming that someone who chose not to demonstrate their capabilities lacked the power to change everything when circumstances demanded action. Amara Volkov had spent years being the person others needed her to be. Now she was choosing to be the person she wanted to become, in a place where that choice was respected and valued. The weapon had learned to be human, and that, perhaps, was the most dangerous transformation of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.